here is a question for you. What if I told you that the car that finally broke the Volkswagen Beetle's stranglehold on the small car market was not built by the Germans, not built by the Italians, and most certainly not built in Detroit? What if the car that rewrote every rule in the automotive playbook was 10 feet long, weighed barely 1,300 pounds, and was sketched out in a matter of weeks by a man who had never driven an automatic transmission in his life? That car was the Mini. Launched on August the 26th, 1959 by the British Motor Corporation, it was not just a new vehicle, it was a statement, a defiant, brilliantly engineered, thoroughly British statement that good things genuinely do come in small packages. To understand why the Mini mattered so deeply, you have to cast your mind back to the Britain of the late 1950s. The country was still climbing out from under the shadow of the Second World War. Rationing had only ended in 1954. Then came the Suez Crisis of 1956, which triggered fuel shortages across Britain and sent petrol prices through the roof overnight. Suddenly, those ridiculous little three-wheeled bubble car, the BMW Isetta, the Messerschmitt, the Heinkel, started appearing on British streets in alarming numbers. Small, cheap to run, ugly as sin. Leonard Lord, the chairman of BMC, reportedly looked at these contraptions with barely disguised fury. The story goes that he vowed to design something that would, in his words, knock these bloody bubble cars off the road. He handed the brief to one man, a Greek-born British engineer named Alec Issigonis, and what followed was nothing short of a revolution. Stay with us, because this is the story of how a 10-foot car changed the world. Topic 1. The crisis that sparked a legend. To properly appreciate what Issigonis achieved, you need to understand the constraints he was working under. This was not a project with years of committee meetings and wind tunnel testing. The development timeline was extraordinarily compressed. From Lord's commission in 1956 to production-ready vehicle in 1959 was a span of roughly 3 years. Astonishingly fast for a car that was so fundamentally different from anything that had come before. The Suez Crisis had done something rather interesting to the British motoring public. It had forced people to think seriously about fuel economy for the first time. A full-sized family saloon of the era, something like the Austin A35 or the Morris Minor, returned perhaps 35 miles to the gallon on a good day. The bubble cars, for all their ugliness, were returning figures closer to 50 and 60 miles per gallon. BMC needed to compete. But they needed to compete with something a British family could actually live with. Issigonis had a bold answer. He drew a rectangle roughly 10 feet long and 4 feet 7.5 inches wide and declared that 80% of that space would be given over to the passengers and their luggage. Only 20% would be mechanical. That was a radical reversal of the conventional thinking of the time, where the engine and drivetrain tended to dominate the packaging decisions and the passengers made do with whatever room was left. The key to making this work was a decision that Issigonis made early in the project, and that would go on to influence virtually every small car built in the following 60 years. He turned the engine sideways by mounting the A-series engine transversely, and that is, across the car rather than along it, and then placing the gearbox directly beneath the engine block in the same oil bath. Issigonis liberated an extraordinary amount of interior space. Engineers at the time said it was borderline reckless. History said it was genius. The wheels, meanwhile, were moved to the very corners of the car, 10-inch units, the smallest ever fitted to a production British automobile at that point, which allowed for a completely flat floor inside the cabin. For a car that measured just 120 inches from bumper to bumper, the interior roominess was, and remains, genuinely startling. Topic 2. The man who designed it on a napkin. Alec Issigonis is one of those figures who deserves far more attention than he typically receives outside of Britain. Born in Smyrna, what is today Izmir, in Turkey, in 1906, to a Greek father who held British citizenship and a Bavarian mother, he came to Britain as a young man and eventually joined Morris Motors. He was, by all accounts, a supremely self-confident engineer who had a deep distrust of market research and an absolute conviction that he knew what the public needed better than the public did. He had already proved himself with the Morris Minor, which launched in 1948 and went on to become one of the most beloved small cars in British history. But the Minor, for all its charm, was a conventional design. The Mini was something else entirely. The famous story, and there is good evidence to support it, is that Issigonis sketched the basic layout of the Mini on a napkin during a dinner. Or not every detail of that legend is accurate, what is certainly true is that the design process was unusually informal by the standards of the time. Issigonis worked with a small, tight team, made decisions quickly, and did not brook interference from accountants or marketing men. There is one design quirk worth mentioning here, because if you ever owned an early Mini, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. The door bins, those large practical pockets set into each door, were Issigonis's idea of where you kept your things. The boot, which opened with an external handle but had the hinges mounted at the bottom so the lid swung down, was both a stroke of packaging genius and, in wet weather, an invitation for water to pour directly into your luggage. These were the kinds of idiosyncrasies that made the Mini maddeningly impractical and utterly lovable in equal measure. He was knighted in 1969 for his contribution to the British motor industry. It was an honour that was, if anything, overdue. Topic 3. The specifications that stop traffic. Let us talk about what was under the bonnet, because this is where things get interesting for anyone who really knows their way around these cars. The original Mini was powered by the BMC A-series engine displacing 848 cubic centimetres. In standard tune, it produced 34 brake horsepower at 5,500 revolutions per minute and 44 pounds-feet of torque at 2,900 revolutions per minute. Those are modest numbers by any objective standard, but they were delivered to the front wheels through a 4-speed manual gearbox, and in a car weighing just 1,340 pounds, they were enough to produce a genuinely lively driving experience. Top speed was in the region of 72 miles per hour. 0 to 60 miles per hour took approximately 27 seconds in the standard car. Not quick, even by the standards of 1959. But that was never the point. The Mini's genius was in how it handled, and that was almost entirely down to the suspension. Issigonis worked with the brilliant engineer Alex Moulton on a rubber cone suspension system that was unlike anything used on a British production car before. Instead of conventional coil springs, each wheel was located by a short rubber cone that acted as both the spring and the damper. The geometry meant the Mini cornered with an almost go-kart-like directness, its tiny wheels and low center of gravity working together to produce handling that was, by 1959 standards, extraordinary. Road and Track magazine, testing the car in 1960, noted that the Mini cornered with a flatness and precision that shamed far larger and more expensive machinery. That was not a casual observation from a publication that did not give compliments lightly. In 1964, BMC introduced the hydroelastic suspension system on the Mini, replacing the original rubber cones with fluid-filled displacers interconnected between front and rear wheels. Many drivers preferred the original setup, and BMC eventually reverted to dry cones in 1969. If you have driven both, you almost certainly have a strong opinion on which was better. The rubber cone cars have the more communicative, precise feel. The hydroelastic cars ride more smoothly, but with a slightly softer character. Topic 4. Taking the fight to the Volkswagen Beetle. Now here is where the story gets genuinely compelling, and where the Mini's achievement needs to be put in proper historical context. In 1959, the Volkswagen Beetle was the dominant small car in Western Europe and increasingly in the United States. Its rear-mounted, air-cooled engine, its sturdy reliability, and its extraordinary marketing, culminating in the legendary Think Small campaign from the American advertising agency Doyle Dane Bernbach, which launched in 1959, the same year as the Mini, had made it a cultural phenomenon on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United Kingdom, the Beetle was the imported small car against which all others were measured. The Mini's arrival changed that equation decisively and quickly. Within a few years of its launch, the Mini had effectively rendered the bubble cars obsolete in Britain, which was precisely what Leonard Lord had set out to do, and had begun eating into the Beetle's market share among buyers who wanted something more modern in concept. The Mini's front-wheel drive and transverse engine layout gave it a crucial advantage in traction and interior packaging over the Beetle's rear-engined rear-wheel drive configuration. In wet British conditions, the front-wheel drive Mini was a measurably more capable machine, and British buyers noticed. By the mid-1960s, the Mini was outselling the Beetle in the United Kingdom by a significant margin. The Monte Carlo rally victories reinforced the message emphatically. Paddy Hopkirk and his co-driver Henry Lydon won the 1964 Monte Carlo rally outright in a Mini Cooper S, a result that stunned the international motorsport community. The Cooper S they drove was powered by a 1,071 cubic centimetre engine, producing around 70 brake horsepower in road-legal trim, though competition versions extracted considerably more. The Mini won the Monte Carlo again in 1965 and 1967, building a competition record that no Volkswagen Beetle ever came close to matching. In the United States, the situation was more nuanced. The Mini was sold there from 1959 initially as the Austin 7, a name that caused some confusion given the pre-war Austin 7's history, and later under various BMC and British Leyland identities. It never achieved the same commercial dominance in America that it enjoyed in Britain, partly because American roads and American expectations were simply different, and partly because the Beetle's marketing in the US was extraordinarily effective. But the Mini found a loyal and enthusiastic following among urban American buyers and those who simply loved the idea of a car that punched so dramatically above its weight. Topic 5. What it cost in 1959 and what it costs today. When the Mini went on sale in August of 1959, it was offered in two versions, the Austin 7 and the Morris Mini Minor. Both were mechanically identical. The differences were cosmetic, including the grille design and badging, a relic of BMC's somewhat peculiar habit of selling the same car under competing mark names through different dealer networks. The original list price in the United Kingdom was £496, 19 shillings and 2 pence. BMC had been absolutely determined to get the car under the £500 mark for psychological reasons, and they just managed it. To put that in context, a weekly wage for a skilled factory worker in Britain in 1959 was in the region of £14 to £16. The Mini, at just under £500, was genuinely affordable by the standards of the time, though still a significant purchase. The Morris Minor, by comparison, was selling for around £600 in basic form. Here is a sobering fact that the people at BMC quietly struggled with. At that launch price, the company was almost certainly losing money on every single Mini it sold. The tooling costs had been enormous, the engineering was complex, and the selling price had been set to hit a market rather than to reflect the true cost of production. It was a gamble that BMC took deliberately, banking on volume to eventually make the numbers work. Production numbers bear out how that gamble played out over time. By the time production of the original Mini finally ended in the year 2000, 41 years after that August launch, a total of 5,387,862 cars had been built. That is a production run of extraordinary duration and scale for a car that started life as an emergency response to a geopolitical crisis. As for values today, a clean, unrestored early Mini in good running condition, something from the first couple of production years with its original rubber cone suspension and sliding windows, will fetch between £12,000 and £20,000 in the British market, depending on specification and provenance. Concours quality examples, particularly the early Austin 7 variants, have reached £30,000 and beyond at specialist auction. The Cooper and Cooper S variants command premium prices well above those figures, with the finest examples of the 1963 to 1967 Cooper S regularly achieving between £40,000 and £60,000 at auction. These are remarkable sums for a car that originally cost less than £500. Topic 6. The cultural earthquake. It would be a mistake to talk about the Mini purely in terms of engineering specifications and production numbers, because what this car did to British culture in the 1960s was something that no specification sheet can capture. The Mini did not just change how people drove, it changed how people thought about cars, about status, about modernity. By the mid-1960s, the Mini had become genuinely classless in a way that virtually no British car before or since has managed. You could walk into a London street and see a Mini owned by a student nurse parked next to one belonging to a film star, because both of them genuinely wanted one. Peter Sellers owned several, the Beatles drove them, Twiggy was photographed in one, Lord Snowdon drove one. This was not merely aspirational association, these people actually drove their Minis and reportedly loved them. The fashion industry embraced the car as readily as the motoring press. The Mini skirt, which emerged in the early 1960s from designers including Mary Quant, who herself drove a Mini, was named in deliberate homage to the car. Both represented the same idea, stripping away the excess, the formality, the stuffiness of the previous generation, and replacing it with something young, practical, direct, and joyful. The Italian Job, the 1969 film starring Michael Caine, cemented the Mini's international reputation in a way that no amount of advertising could have managed. Those three Minis, red, white, and blue, threading through the streets and rooftops of Turin with Benny Hill's music playing, became one of the most iconic sequences in British cinema. The film introduced the Mini to audiences who had never considered owning one and made it a symbol of a very particular kind of British spirit, quick, clever, nimble, and rather pleased with itself. So where does this leave us? What do we make of a 10-foot, 848 cubic centimetre, 34 brake horsepower machine that cost its maker money to sell, that frustrated its owners with a boot that let in the rain, that had its gearbox swimming in engine oil, and that took the better part of 30 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour? We make of it, I think, one of the most consequential automobiles ever built. not just in Britain, in the world. The transverse engine and front-wheel drive layout that Issigonis pioneered in 1959 is now the dominant configuration for small and medium cars globally. When you get behind the wheel of virtually any modern hatchback, you are sitting in a car whose basic architecture traces a direct line back to that rectangle Issigonis drew in 1956. That is an engineering legacy of quite extraordinary reach. And yet, for those of us who knew these cars in their working lives, who remember the way a well-sorted Mini felt through a set of bends on a wet country road, who remember the extraordinary visibility and the feeling that you were somehow connected to the road in a way that few other cars of the era could match. The numbers and the historical significance almost feel like a distraction. The Mini was simply, genuinely, brilliantly fun to drive, and that is not something that any amount of historical context can improve upon. The Volkswagen Beetle is a fine car with a remarkable history of its own. But Britain's answer to it, that improbable little machine from Longbridge, changed the rules in ways that the Beetle never did. 50 years on, engineers are still learning from it. That is the measure of what Alec Issigonis achieved. Now I want to hear from you. Did you own a Mini? Did your family have one? Do you have a strong view on rubber cones versus hydroelastic? Was the Cooper S the greatest small car achievement of the 1960s? Or have I missed something entirely? Tell me in the comments. This audience knows these cars better than any reference book, and your experiences are exactly what this channel is built for. If you found this worthwhile, please do consider subscribing and giving this video a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach the people who care about this history as much as we do. We have much more to come, and we are grateful, truly grateful, for every single one of you who watches, comments, and keeps this conversation alive. Until next time, till next.